Hello, it's my great pleasure in welcoming you to our online parliamentary event. As you know, right now we're urgently calling on the global wildlife trade ban in order to prevent future pandemics and end the needless suffering of animals. Sadly, COVID-19 is spiraling out of control. And whilst it's not the first disease linked to animals, we know that there are many other infections before that, such as SARS, Ebola, and HIV, believed to have been transmitted from animals to humans. COVID-19 has been a complete wake-up call to the world, and we believe, therefore, that there has never been a more urgent case for the global wildlife trade ban. In order to tackle this problem, we've been busy spearheading the campaign to end wildlife trade. It's a coalition urging the UK government to champion an end to the international trade in wild animals and wild animal products at the G20 this November. In addition, we recently handed our petition in to Downing Street with over 165,000 signatures from people across the UK in support of our call. And globally, we've reached almost 1 million signatures to date. Now, I know we've got a very packed schedule, so before I go, I'd like to say a massive thank you to our guest speakers for making this event possible. And I'd also like to share with you a short video on why we're calling for the wildlife trade ban. Now, this may seem like a hugely ambitious goal for us to achieve. However, I urge all of you to continue showing your support for the UK government in order to push this through at the G20 this November. Thank you.
We've suspected it for quite some time, but now it's official.
The coronavirus is the biggest threat this country has faced for decades.
The global wildlife trade creates a lethal hotbed of disease that originates from animals, leading to deadly outbreaks like SARS, Ebola, and now COVID-19. With the devastating impact and grim reality of the COVID-19 pandemic sweeping across the globe, we can no longer ignore the dangers of exploiting wild animals. This isn't just a problem that's happening on the other side of the world. The wildlife trade is a global problem that requires a global solution. A Wild Animal Protection Freedom of Information request revealed that from 2014 to 18, the UK imported almost 3.5 million wild animals from 90 countries, including from known emerging disease hotspots. To protect our health and to end the suffering of millions of animals, we're calling on the UK government to champion a global wildlife trade ban to help prevent a future zoonotic pandemic. With some species being taken to the brink of extinction, wild animals being farmed in horrendous conditions, and millions more being needlessly exploited, the time has come to act.
We've just handed in our petition to 10 Downing Street with over 165,000 signatures from people across the UK, all united in calling on the PM to champion a global wildlife trade ban at the G20 meeting of global leaders in November. We're urging the UK government to now take action to end the global suffering of millions of wild animals in the trade, to help protect our precious biodiversity and to help keep us safe from a future global pandemic.
Hello, and thank you all for joining us today. And thanks also to World Animal Protection for coordinating this short but timely event, which has the support of 25 additional sponsoring animal welfare bodies and is held to promote the campaign to end the illegal and the currently legal trade in wildlife. In a few minutes, we shall hear an overview of infectious disease concerns regarding the international wildlife trade. From relatively innocuous to the almost invariable fatal, zoonotic diseases, that's diseases spread from animals to people, have a major impact upon individuals and society as a whole. It's estimated that 60 to 70% of emerging human diseases originate in animals, including viruses such as HIV, Ebola virus, Zika virus, and avian influenza viruses. The COVID-19 pandemic has unfortunately highlighted the potential global impact of an emerging infectious disease from wildlife. More human contact with wildlife and more movement of wildlife out of their natural habitats, the greater the risk of exposure to and movement of infectious diseases. J. Scott Weiss is a veterinary internist and a diplomate of the American College of Veterinary Internal Medicine. He's a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences, a professor of the Ontario Veterinary College, the University of Guelph, director of the University of Guelph Centre for Public Health and Zoonosis, and the chief of infection control at the Ontario Veterinary College Teaching Hospital. Professor Weiss.
Thank you, Sir Roger. I appreciate the opportunity to talk today about the exotic animal trade and infectious diseases, something that's particularly relevant during our COVID-19 pandemic. For me, it's important to think about this general concept that we're not a population of people living amongst populations of dogs and cats and horses and iguanas or whatever, that we're a population of animals. And while we have our specific human and animal diseases, there can be a lot of crossover. And the microbes that we encounter, they don't care that we call ourselves human and that we call those other things animals. They just care if there's a host. And some of those microbes can infect people and animals. And that's the concept of a zoonotic disease or a zoonotic infection, something that can be passed from animals to people. And this is particularly relevant for emerging diseases because it's been estimated that about 60 to 75% of emerging diseases of people originated in animals. And some of these can be very mild, some of these can be a global pandemic. Now, every interaction we have with a person or an animal creates some risk. The less we know about that individual, the farther they're removed from us, geographically, ecologically, microbiologically, the greater the risk. The more we go into new areas, or the more we bring things from more exotic locations into our areas, the greater the risk. So the more we move animals, the greater the risk. And the outcome can be quite variable. Some of these things can be very mild. So ringworm is that top left. A fairly minor infection, can be problematic still, but minor overall. Rabies is another example at the opposite extreme, an almost invariably fatal disease with a lot of things in between. So the consequences of zoonotic infections can be highly variable. So we need to think about the risk and the reward, or the cost and the benefit, because there are definite benefits of interactions with animals and use of animals, and there are definite risks with that. And we need to think about the individual and particularly the societal benefits. And if we think about the wildlife trade, now we're talking about international movement of wildlife, what really are the societal benefits of moving large numbers of animals across broad geographic distances and comparing them to the risks? And risk isn't static, it changes. And it's changing with a lot of things that we're encountering right now. So climate change, urban expansion, armed conflict, population displacement, or overall mobility, and increasing wealth in developing countries. These increase our exposure to wild areas, increase our exposure to wild animals, and often increase the movement of animals outside of those areas and outside of those countries, accentuating some risk. Now, COVID-19 is a good example. good in a very bad way, obviously. But this is the third major coronavirus jump from animals and people in the last 20 years, and it's not going to be the last. We had the original SARS, we had MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, bats to camels to people, that kills about 30% of people that it infects. And we've had COVID-19. And presumably there are more coronaviruses lurking out there that could infect us given the opportunity. And we have other globally relevant high-profile diseases, HIV, Zika virus, Ebola virus, avian influenza, all these creating issues that can be of relevance locally, nationally, globally. And sometimes there are issues more at the lower level. This could be a child getting sick with salmonellosis from their pet reptile. We've got an example of customs officers that got sick from smuggled birds in Belgium. Or it could be animals moving vectors, animals moving ticks that carry their own diseases. And you combine that with climate change that makes it able for those ticks to survive, we can introduce new diseases into areas with those ticks. So many things will increase the risk. And essentially, the more animal movement, the more we go into areas we haven't been before, and in particular, the more we bring those animals out of those areas and spread them around to a lot of other people, we increase that risk. And there is a significant bad luck component of this. The virus that causes COVID, it just didn't emerge in November in the bat population. It's been lurking there for a while, and there was this bad luck exposure of movement of it to a person somehow. Was it just that single bat to human exposure? Maybe, right? Was that one bad luck incident enough to cause a global pandemic? Probably. And there are other viruses out there that could do this. So are we one bad luck incident away from just a single sick person, or a local outbreak, or a disease outbreak in animals, or another global pandemic? And this virus is originally called the Wuhan coronavirus because that's where it was first identified. But as we move animals so much and so often, could this easily have been, with some bad luck, the Tokyo coronavirus, or the Toronto coronavirus, or the London coronavirus, because we happen to move that index case from its region somewhere else, as we're doing on a daily basis? So I think we have some important things to think about in the context of COVID-19, but more broadly of how we interact with animals, how we interact with wildlife, and what the risks pose, and how we can maximize the benefits and minimize the costs of our interaction with animals in general. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Scott, for making that chilling and, if I say so, very compelling case. Sir David Amess has been an animal welfare campaigner for all of his 37 years in the House of Commons, and I know that because he and I entered the House at the same time in 1983. He's backed the campaign to end the wildlife trade, and he recently tabled EDM 873 on the global wildlife trade and the prevention of future zoonotic pandemics. David is very passionate indeed about animal welfare. We know that from his record during his time as a Member of Parliament. He introduced the Protection Against Cruel Tethering Act. He sponsored the Horses and Ponies Bill, the Pet Animals Bill, and he also sponsored the Responsible Pet Ownership competition for MPs. David won the Dodds Animal Welfare and Environment Award for his leading role in and commitment to animal welfare. That award is given to the parliamentarian who's done the most to tackle issues concerning the welfare of animals and the natural environment. More recently, David successfully campaigned to stop the unethical practice of testing domestic products on animals, tackled the illegal wildlife trade, and fought to put an end to puppy farming. So David is a prominent voice in the culling of badgers debate. He consistently votes against any changes to the Hunting Act, and his dedication to animal welfare is second to none. Sir David Amess.
Roger, this is a long journey that we've been on, as you rightly remind us, but I think at long last we are getting somewhere. And I want to thank all those people who have joined us today for caring for those animals who can't speak for themselves. And the videos that we have just seen are truly shocking, and this wicked trade needs to end. So last month I tabled an early day motion entitled The Global Wildlife Trade and Prevention of Future Zoonotic Pandemics, which has been signed by members across the political spectrum. Even though we don't always agree with one another, I think we do agree that this wicked trade has to stop. And it is reassuring that members from a range of parties do agree with us on this particular issue. So as a patron of the Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation, I'm pleased that the charity is working with the World Animal Protection Organization and has formed the Campaign to End Wildlife Trade with 23 other leading animal welfare groups. Thank you all and congratulations to you. Britain is known to be a nation of animal lovers, it's said so often. But the problem of selling animals, which obviously there must be a demand for, or animal products, isn't just a country-specific one, it spans across all the continents. It is a global problem. The global trade of wild animals, as we've seen in the videos, is cruel, unsustainable, and puts our health and the world economy at risk. The income generated from the commercial wildlife trade doesn't compare to the economic costs of the loss of biodiversity and zoonotic diseases, as we are currently experiencing with COVID-19. And therefore ending the global wildlife trade is an investment in the future. The global wildlife trade has many negative impacts on our ecosystems and on our health. It massively decreases biodiversity. It causes harm to the animals which we share this planet with, and it increases the risk of future pandemics and zoonotic diseases. The second biggest threat to species survival after habitat destruction is wildlife trade. The global wildlife trade can massively reduce biodiversity and cause animals to become endangered and even extinct. Tigers, rhinoceroses, elephants, they've all suffered particularly hard from the sale of their skin, bones, and tusks. The loss of biodiversity causes serious issues for the complex web of life. You cannot simply remove a large number of plants or animals from the environments and not expect there to be serious consequences that affect the whole of the ecosystem. Animals, ladies and gentlemen, are sentient beings, and scientifically, studies prove that they can feel emotions, pain, and pleasure. An animal's welfare is significantly put at risk throughout the whole supply chain of the wildlife trade, from capture to transport, to breeding, to captivity, and ultimately to slaughter. It limits their natural behaviour and affects their psychological well-being, which can last for many years if they are kept as pets or simply as entertainments. However, not all of the negative impacts of the global wildlife trade are related to animals. Humans are also severely impacted. For example, as we've heard already, by the introduction of deadly diseases into our societies. Zoonotic diseases are responsible, as has already been said, for over 2 billion cases of human illness and over 2 million human deaths each year. Currently, with the world in the midst of a pandemic, this is more relevant than ever. But COVID-19 isn't the first zoonotic disease. Previously, we had SARS, Ebola, and MERS, which, just like COVID-19, are believed to have been passed from wildlife to humans. We have obviously not learnt the lessons of the past, and now history is repeating itself. The G20 are meeting in Saudi Arabia next month, and they will focus on coordinating a global response to the coronavirus pandemic. Coronavirus has exposed the urgent need to keep wild animals in the wild, something I, Roger, and others have spent decades campaigning for. With currently over 1.1 million global deaths from coronavirus, and the UK in the top 15 countries with the greatest number of deaths, measures need to be taken swiftly. A reduction in the transmission of zoonotic diseases can be done in a number of ways, which also improves animal welfare. So, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, we need to implement domestic and international laws and regulations that prevent illegal wildlife trade. However, these laws must be accompanied by harsh enough deterrence to stop criminals from exploiting the Earth's biodiversity and increasing the spread of zoonotic diseases in the future. Fines are simply not effective deterrents. It is not only the responsibility of the humans and those involved in the supply of goods in the wildlife trade industry, but is also very much up to the consumers. Governmental efforts should be targeted at reducing or preferably redirecting consumer spending habits and demand away from live wild animals and their body parts, including, dare I say, in the fashion industry. We need to transition from the short-term perception that animals are here for our use towards the global long-term understanding that animals are crucial for protecting the natural habitat and therefore humans too. As a global community, it is our responsibility to invest in a sustainable future that is not based on the exploitation of animals and the wildlife trade, but is instead based on accepting that animals and plants have a right to share the earth with us. We benefit from them and they benefit from us. Animal welfare, human well-being, and sustainability of our economies are all linked. In order to reduce the chances of another global catastrophe like COVID-19, our government, the government which I support, needs to commit to banning the global wildlife trade.
Thank you very much indeed, Sir David Ames. Dame Jane Goodall is an ethologist and an environmentalist. She's the founder of the Jane Goodall Institute and the United Nations Messenger of Peace. In July 1960, at the age of 26, she travelled from England to what is now Tanzania, and she ventured into the little-known world of the wild chimpanzees living in Gombe. Equipped with just a notebook, binoculars, and a fascination with wildlife, Dr. Goodall braved a realm of unknowns to give the world a remarkable window into humankind's closest living relatives. Through 60 years of groundbreaking work, she's not only shown us the urgent need to protect chimpanzees from extinction, she's also redefined species conservation to include the needs of local people and the environment. Today, there are 24 Jane Goodall Institutes working to support JGI's core programs. A community conservation program, 2 sanctuaries for orphan chimpanzees, and Roots and Shoots, JGI's environmental and humanitarian program, which empowers young people of all ages to become involved in hands-on projects for their community, animals, and the environment in more than 65 countries. Dr. Jane Goodall.
Hello, this is Jane Goodall. The global trade in wild animals and their body parts is, first of all, horrendously cruel. But in addition, it causes serious ecological damage, and we're already losing biodiversity all around the world. Finally, this trade is posing a very real threat to human health. The selling and buying of wild animals for food, for medicine, for the use of their skins, for trinkets, and for the growing international trade in wild animals as exotic pets provides ample opportunities for a pathogen, such as a virus or a bacteria, to spill over from an animal to a human. And there it may cause a new zoonotic disease, such as the virus that caused the current pandemic that is causing suffering and economic chaos around the world. It's desperately important that we come together to find a new relationship with the natural world, a new and more compassionate relationship with the animals with whom we share the planet. And I truly hope that the UK government and other representatives of the G20 countries we'll get together and really work on a plan to end this global trade at the next G20 summit in November. Thank you.
Our enormous thanks to Jane Goodall for her message today and also for a lifetime's work. Luke Pollard is the MP for Plymouth Sutton and Devonport. He's a Shadow Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and he's a strong supporter of the campaign to end wildlife trade. Luke was elected as the Labour and Cooperative Member of Parliament for Plymouth Sutton and Devonport in June 2017, and he was re-elected in 2019. He was born and lives in Plymouth, and he's the first MP to be born in Plymouth since Michael Foot represented the city in 1945. After winning his seat, he became a member of the Transport Select Committee. He served many roles on Labour's Shadow Environment team and as PPS to the former Shadow Environment Secretary Sue Hayman, and as the Shadow Minister for Fishing, Water and Coastal Communities. He was promoted to Shadow Environment Secretary himself in January 2020. Luke Pollard.
Thanks very much, Sir Roger, and thank you for that introduction. And can I say right from the start, thank you to everyone who is joining this campaign, who is uniting against the trade in international wildlife. It is even more important that we do that. I want to take a look at the context at the moment, because COVID-19 needs to be a wake-up call for us as a planet. And it also means we need to look at what are the challenges that flow from COVID-19, that helped cause COVID-19, and how can we ensure that we don't ever find ourselves in this place again. The pandemic has shown that zoonotic diseases are an ever-present threat to us. They're not something that is only the confines of Hollywood movies. It's now a lived reality for the entire planet. With 70% of emerging infection diseases thought to originate from wildlife, we need to really take time to understand how that is happening, and especially looking at the commercial trade in wildlife and what effect that is having on our health as a species, but also the future for those species in their own habitats. But before I get there, I just want to ask you what you learned from the pandemic, what you learned from lockdown in particular. Are there things that are now more important to you, having been through lockdown, than they were beforehand? Have you realized what really matters? Because if, like me, you found yourself wanting to spend more time with family, wanting to spend more time with friends, especially those people you haven't been able to due to restrictions, you wanted a better connection with folks, you're concerned about the future, and you've started to value nature in a much bigger way. Now, I'm an out and out greenie, so I'm quite pro nature anyway, but actually being able to hear the birds sing for the very first time in a long time is one of the common experiences of people during lockdown. And that's created this desire amongst the people that myself, David and Roger represent, to build back better, to make sure that our future is better than we have at the moment. These things really matter, but in realizing that we're stuck in this inescapable challenge, do we act? Do we walk on by? Do we have the agency to do something about it? And I think we do. But I worry that instead of just acting or walking on by, we're finding ourselves in this really callous trap, devious trap, where we're being led to believe that we're acting, but actually we're simply deferring action, creating an illusion that's designed to continue life as normal for much as possible without the need for the heavy lifting or the difficult changes that are required. Building back better must be more than a 3-word soundbite. It must be more than just giving the pretense of change without the necessary actions. If we are to cut the carbon emissions that we need to do to prevent irreversible climate change, if we are to restore natural environments, if we are to clean the air that we breathe and to defend the biodiversity that's so precious and so fragile, then we need to take proper and serious actions, and we need to do so now. And that's where the campaign to end the international trade in wildlife is so important. Stopping the illegal wildlife trade is one of the most important and urgent tasks that we face as a planet. It isn't a single task though. It's not a single administrative measure, not a silver bullet, but it's a catalogue of 1,001 different actions. Each of those demands international collaboration, cooperation, and respect. Each needs to rebalance humanity's relationship with nature. Each requires a better assessment of the economic conditions, a better understanding of the natural world, and the interplay between people and our actions as a species and the planet. They're big challenges, and this isn't an easy task. World Animal Protection, like so many other NGOs, have set their sights really high. And that's really important, because aiming low is accepting the destruction of vital habitats, the extinction of majestic beasts, household names, and the accompanying rich ecosystem of insects, small mammals and birds that we lose to extinction every week, but we don't know the names of. 2020 needs to be a wake-up call, not just in public health, in fairness and inequality, but about nature and our relationship with it too. I'm not sure if you've seen Sir David Attenborough's latest film on Netflix. He introduces a whole new audience to his past and the wondrous diversity of the planet. But it also makes for quite unpleasant watching. As a planet, we're trending towards darker times, with more pollution, fewer species, fewer habitats, and especially fewer wildernesses and sites of wildlife abundance. That's why the campaign to end the wildlife trade is necessary. We're facing a global poaching crisis, which is threatening to overturn decades of conservation successes. And that means really iconic animals like elephants, rhinos, and tigers. The situation for them is crucial. But we also know that human activity is encroaching more and more and more into unspoilt wildernesses, into places where wildlife was previously able to thrive. And we know that that is deliberate. It's not accidental that humans are growing and building into these areas. It's deliberate, just as the international trade in animals is deliberate. Now, some of that is legal, but much of it is not. And understanding that poaching and much of the international trade in animals is often run by international crime syndicates, international criminals, organized crime, is really disturbing. Because if you can smuggle an animal, if you can import things illegally, what stops you smuggling drugs, weapons, or children as well? Ending the wildlife trade, therefore, is not just a necessary environmental goal. It needs to be a calling for all those people whose moral compasses are pointed in the right direction. World Animal Protection are making the case that the wildlife trade and the increasing encroachment of humanity into habitats risks the further spread of zoonotic diseases. We know that the risks of disease spreading from the animal kingdom to humanity is real, and we know that those risks are increasing because of our activities as a species. What we can't say for sure is where the next zoonotic disease will come from. What we don't know is where it will originate from, what the effect will be. But we do know that pandemics are a clear and present danger to public health. They're also something that we can do something about to mitigate the risks. Humans encroaching on the habitats of wild animals might be making it more likely for zoonotic diseases to spread. By banning the wildlife trade, we can make the case about a better relationship between humans and the animal kingdom. We can help make poaching less lucrative. We can help support and value those animals in their natural habitat rather than shipping them around the world. We're in a climate and ecological emergency. And when Parliament declared a climate emergency, we didn't just declare it about climate, we declared it about our ecology as well, about the breadth of biodiversity that we're losing as a planet each and every day. And we must do something about it. That's why the campaign that World Animal Protection is leading to end the wildlife trade is so important. The coalition of 25 of the UK's leading animal welfare and conservation groups are doing the right thing in calling on the UK government to champion an end to the international trade in wild animals and wild animal products. It won't be easy to do so, but I think it's necessary and urgent. It's also a campaign that enjoys cross-party support. Myself, Sir Roger, and Sir David, we don't always agree on some of the big political issues facing the country, but we agree on this. And I think we also agree on what type of country we want Britain to be. A beacon of hope, of best practice, of leading by example. And that's why calling on the UK government to step up at this time, to build international collaboration and activities, to legislate against the international trade in wildlife, yes, but also take steps to ensure that's enforced, to take steps to ensure that those communities that are encroaching into fragile habitats have an economic and viable alternative, that we can make the case for animals being kept alive in their habitats being worth more than dead animals being shipped abroad or animals suffering because of their import and export. There's a real opportunity here to speak loudly, clearly, with one voice. Celebrities, politicians, members of the public, scientists, all together saying that we need to end the wildlife, the trade in international wildlife. It is something that 2020 has given us pause for thought to do. And as we consider what is important to us now, we need to be serious and focused that ending the wildlife trade is near the top of our to-do list. And for the UK government, with the G20, with COP26, and with the Conference on Biodiversity in China next year, we have an opportunity to make that voice a global one and deliver global action. Thank you for what you're doing, and please keep it up.
Thank you, Luke, for that very clear and compelling message. And thank you also for reminding us all that animal welfare and concern for the environment is not and must not be a party political issue. Now, just before we go into the question and answer session, we've got a number of personal messages addressed to the United Kingdom government from some of those high-profile personalities that co-signed a letter to the Prime Minister earlier in the year. That was in support of World Animal Protection and the campaign to end wildlife trade.
Sadly, COVID-19 isn't the first zoonotic emerging infectious disease that is devastating lives because of our cruel treatment of wild animals. And it won't be the last unless we change our relationship with the natural world. The time for bold action is now. That's why I'm asking the UK government to back our call to end the global wildlife trade at the G20 summit in November.
If ever there was a wake-up call, this has to be it. There's so much human suffering, plus a global financial bill of trillions of pounds, and all because we continue to trade in wild animals. 30 years ago, I visited those markets in China where COVID-19 is believed to have originated, and I can say they are truly awful places. And actually, they still make me feel sick every time I think about them all these years later. You've got species from macaques and iguanas to dogs and snakes that should never meet face to face, and they're crammed alive into tiny cages and piled on top of one another under incredibly stressful conditions. COVID-19 was predictable, but now that it's happened, now that it's here, it's got to be a tipping point that governments simply can't ignore. The threat of disease transmission is inherent in each and every step of the wildlife trade, illegal and legal. And that's why I'm asking you to do everything in your power to encourage and secure a wildlife trade ban agreement at the upcoming G20 summit in November.
Every single day, thousands of animals are forced into the multi-billion-dollar global trade in wildlife. They're killed for food, they're harvested for traditional medicines, they're traded as exotic pets, and in some cases, their body parts are used for luxury products. They're also often forced into a lifetime of suffering in the name of entertainment. Trading wild animals, regardless of whether the trade is legal or illegal, is completely unnecessary and cruel. And so I'm asking the UK government to please fight for our future at the G20 summit in November. I'm asking you to do all in your power to secure an agreement on measures to end the awful global wildlife trade.
Wild animals are not a commodity, they are living sentient beings. It's imperative that we address our self-destructive relationship with the natural world. The opportunity to set ourselves on a safer, kinder and more sustainable path is right now. I urge the UK government to back our call to end the global wildlife trade at the upcoming G20 meeting.
COVID-19 is a zoonotic infectious disease, just like SARS and Ebola and MERS and many, many others. These are all viruses that have jumped the species barrier from wildlife to humans, and that jump was facilitated by the trade in wild animals and wild animal parts. This trade doesn't just damage biodiversity and fragile ecosystems, but, as we have learned this year, comes at a huge cost to human health. Now, we can reduce the impact of future zoonotic diseases, and the time for action is now. That's why I'm asking the UK government to back the call to end the global wildlife trade at the upcoming G20 meeting. Thank you.
Thanks to all of those personalities and indeed to the many other personalities who support this campaign. We're now going back to Sir David Amess and Luke Pollard for the question and answer session. And for this, we're joined also by Sonal Badiani-Hammond, who you saw earlier in the introductory film, and who, of course, is representing the campaign. So the first question comes from Damien Carrington, who's the environment editor of The Guardian. And Damien Carrington wants to know, what new action should the UK government be taking in response to the COVID-19 pandemic to reduce both the destruction of wildlife and the risk of future zoonotic disease outbreaks? Luke Pollard, would you like to have a crack at that?
Yeah, if only it was an easy soundbite to say, because actually the to-do list that we need the government doing here is plentiful. And it means not only looking at the big international activities that we've just been speaking about on the call here, it means actually making sure we're investing in the right science to understand what's going on, where the disease risks are. And I think there's something more fundamental here. I think the challenge is about where the motivation comes from. What I want to see from ministers is a clear motivation, a desire, a public statement that ending the wildlife trade, research into this, international collaboration is part of their objective, is part of their strategy. And it's in making that clear statement, I think that other countries will be able to get behind this effort, that will be able to persuade our friends and allies, even those countries don't always get along with, to make the steps that we need to. But I think it stems from that first step of saying, well, actually, this is important, this is serious, and we need to do something about it. And that's why that big picture matters so much, because the Department for Health, the Department for International Trade's to-do list need flow from that first primary statement. At the moment, I can't hear that as loud as I think we need to hear it. And that is where I think all of us play a part in encouraging them to make that commitment and therefore deliver the action plan that flows from it.
Thanks very much. David.
Well, there is an increase in zoonotic diseases, partly because we have destroyed natural habitat. And so as a result, we live closer to animals. That's true. But the UK government has taken robust action to reduce the destruction of wildlife and the risk of future zoonotic disease outbreaks by, in a number of ways, most noticeably by committing to restore natural habitat. For example, the Treasury has pledged £640 million for the Nature for Climate Fund to plant more than 40 million trees and to restore 35,000 hectares of peatland in England. It has also announced an investment of up to £25 million to create the Nature Recovery Network in England. This intends to improve, expand and connect habitats to address wildlife decline and provide wider environmental benefits for people. Similarly, the Darwin Plus programme has been tripled to £10 million a year, which protects unique wildlife in the UK overseas territories. However, it is true, Sir Roger, the UK government could be doing more to reduce the destruction of wildlife and the risk of future zoonotic disease outbreaks. This could be done by banning the wildlife trade and reducing the risk of zoonotic disease transmission. Additionally, if more finance was delivered to the local level to support local action and local priorities, then more efficient collaborative partnerships between communities, government and the private sector to develop and deliver solutions that address common concerns could be invested in.
Thanks very much. We've got a question from Kerry McCarthy, who's another Member of Parliament. So, Sonal, in recent years, there's been a lot of focus on illegal wildlife trade, but what action should the government be taking to tackle that trade?
Well, thank you, Sir Roger. We believe that all trade, whether legal or illegal, causes suffering to millions of wild animals. It's contributing to biodiversity loss and it's posing a public health risk to us all. So we recently submitted a Freedom of Information request to the Animal, Plant and Health Agency to get an understanding of what the legal trade looks like here in the UK. And we found that millions of wild animals are currently being imported into our country. And that's despite the public health risk that we've heard about that they pose. And it's happening completely legally. So while public and government attention and focus has been on the illegal wildlife trade, which, for example, protect species when they're on that brink of extinction, for example, within CITES. This is actually being dwarfed by the completely legal trade that's happening in this country, despite that public health risk and despite the cruelty as well imposed on animals. So this is why we're now calling on the UK government to ban the import and export of legal trade coming into the UK as part of that bigger call for a global wildlife trade ban at the G20 meeting in November.
Thanks very much. We're going to get in-house now. We've got a question from Steve McIver, who's the CEO of World Animal Protection. And Steve asks, beyond the G20, how can the UK government continue to use upcoming international opportunities, such as COP15, the UK presidency of the G7 and COP26, to tackle the root causes of COVID-19? That's a nice, easy question for Luke.
It's a good one. And I think, you know, if you were to ask that question to folks who are not on this call, who don't automatically become equipped with a desire to do something about zoonotic diseases or deal with international protection, COP15, as an example, would not ring a bell. And I think as a country, we're underplaying the importance, in particular, of COP15. Now, this is China's first ever opportunity hosting a conference of the parties. It really is a really important moment to deal with not only the debate around zoonotic diseases, but also the protection of biodiversity. China wants this to be a success. And I think rightly, we're putting all our eggs in the COP26 basket, which deals with, instead of biodiversity, deals with carbon. That's we're hosting in Glasgow next year. But we also need to make sure we're carrying into both those conferences that same high-level approach about what we want to achieve here. And that's where I think there is an opportunity to do more. And, you know, if you're looking at, you know, what is the role that Britain can play? Yes, we have still a very, very large economic power, but we have a soft power that is so much greater than our economic power. We have influence. We have the ability to marshal our international friends and international support behind a series of asks. I think we kind of know where we're going for COP26, but I want to see ministers make a clear statement about what their objectives are, what their negotiating objectives are for COP15 and for the other areas about biodiversity. Because if we only allow a debate that's about carbon, don't get me wrong, it's very important. We need that to work, but we also need to have a debate around biodiversity and our ecological protections at the same time. And so we need to not let ministers off from having views and having large-scale strategic objectives around biodiversity. Quite a lot of small projects the UK is very good at, actually, and we do an awful lot of good between those, but we have this opportunity to do so much more by using our soft power and our international influence, and that is an opportunity which is time limited. We have a limited window to do that, and that's why this pressure on ministers, not only the Prime Minister, but also the work of the Foreign Development Office, or whatever it's called this week, and all the and business and international trade, is so important in making that case right across government and its activities.
Thanks, Luke. We've got to move this along. So, David, what I'm going to do now is say, please answer any of that if you wish to. But I'm going to toss you another question, which comes from Baroness Jones of Moulsecoombe, who is, of course, a member of the House of Lords. And Baroness Jones wants to know, how important is the tackling of wildlife trade as part of the efforts to reduce biodiversity loss? Over to you.
Well, Roger, there isn't much which Luke said in answer to the previous question that I could disagree with him. I rather agree with his answers, but very important, this question for Baroness Jones. Globally, wildlife trade is the second biggest threat to vital biodiversity of our planet, following habitat loss. Biodiversity is the variety and viability of life on Earth. Therefore, if the wildlife trade is reduced, there will be fewer species which are made endangered and even extinct as humans stop exploiting them and or killing them. Since 1970, the planet has lost, as I said earlier in my speech, 60% of its vertebrate wildlife population. Further, a UN report concluded that 1 million species face extinction due to human causes, many within mere decades. So a recent study found that 958 species listed as at risk by the International Union for Conservation of Nature were in danger of extinction because they have been traded internationally, which is especially true for elephants, rhinoceroses, and pangolins.
Thanks very much. Now I'm going to put two questions together. They're both sort of insider questions for Sonal, I think. Brian DeCal, who is the director of Four Paws UK and who is a coalition member of the Campaign to End Wildlife Trade, wants to know what barriers you foresee in achieving consensus on and effectively implementing a wildlife trade ban. And then Lorraine Platt, who's the co-founder of Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation and who's also a coalition member of the Campaign to End Wildlife Trade, wants to know what role you see the tripartite, which is the OIE, the World Health Organization and the FAO, playing in achieving a global wildlife trade ban. So the thrust of that, Sonal, basically is, what are the blocks to getting to where we want to be?
Well, thank you, Sir Roger. If I address Brian's question about the greatest challenge, I suppose, I think one of them is that we are fighting a prevailing belief that the best way to conserve or to protect wildlife has been to use wildlife, but to use it sustainably, basically to allow people to benefit from the commodification of wild animals and to exploit them as long as they're not driven to the brink of extinction. And whilst we can see now, we are absolutely living in the midst of a biodiversity crisis. It's unfolding at the same time as exponential population growth, and at the same time as we're seeing increasing consumer demand for wildlife and wildlife products. And so the trade really is completely unsustainable, and we need to take urgent action, not to protect species when they are nearly extinct, but to bring in and trigger that protection at the beginning and to start actually taking action to view animals differently, to address our relationship with them, to stop perpetuating this belief that it's okay to use them, and instead to protect them from the very outset and to ban the global wildlife trade. And coming to Lorraine's question about the tripartite, we really need our experts to work together. We need them to work together with the G20 leaders, and we need them to present the scientific evidence to the G20 about the root causes of the pandemic so that we can have an action plan about how we can make sure that this doesn't happen again. You know, we've experienced previous zoonotic epidemics before with SARS, Ebola, HIV. We've heard all about it on this meeting. But what we didn't do in the past is actually learn from those lessons, and we need to learn from that in action and make sure that we never again experience the human repercussions of a zoonotic disease outbreak.
Thank you very much indeed. Very quick answers this time, please, from first David and then from Luke. I'm going to shorten this. Sean Robinson, who's a signatory to the petition, wants to know how we can push the government into taking affirmative action to help animals and end the wildlife trade. Very quickly, please. David first, then Luke.
Well, simply, we can show the UK government that the wildlife trade is not just about the protection of animals' welfare, it also has negative economic impacts. We can also show the UK government that animals are beneficial humans, and so we shouldn't exploit them through the wildlife trade.
Final word from Luke.
Don't be silent on this. Get in touch with your MPs. We get more correspondence about animals than we do about anything else, but that means that animal welfare is higher up the agenda for many parliamentarians. But give them a clear ask. Say, press the minister to support ending the wildlife trade at the G20 meeting. Ask them to do something on behalf of those animals that don't have a voice in this debate.
Thank you very much indeed. That leads me neatly into the closing remark, which is, if you're a member of Parliament of the House of Commons who signs early day motions, please do remember to sign the EDM. If you don't sign early day motions, or even if you do, please write to the Prime Minister from either house or indeed from outside and make your views known. My thanks to all of you for joining us today and for all of those who have participated, and of course most particularly to World Animal Protection for again coordinating the event. Thank you.
Government to listen to the public, NGOs and cross-party support to secure a global wildlife trade ban at the G20.